So hi guys, this is the recording for chapter 5, the hand-drawn notes, and it goes over tissues, all the tissues in the body. So tissues is a level of organization, and its place is between cells and organs. And if you remember at the beginning of the semester, we did this hierarchical organization of things, and we began with the very basic molecules, and then we worked our way up to cells, and then tissues, then organs, and then organ systems, and then of course you. But today we're going to focus on tissues. In tissues, the study of tissues is, you learned in lab, that's histology. And if you Wikipedia, if you Google it, you'll find that you have about 200 types of cells in your body, and that's a broad category of cells. So that's a whole lot of different types of cells. But to be a tissue, we need a good definition here. To be a tissue, you have to be a diverse group of cells within an ordered structure that work together towards some common function. So in other words, you have to be more than one type of cell to be that are working together to be considered a tissue. Okay, so the main 4 types of tissues, these are broad categories, big picture tissue types, are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and then nervous tissue. So we spend entire lectures going over muscular tissue and nervous tissue. So we're going to focus mainly on epithelial and connective tissue. Epithelial tissue, remember, you'll see it abbreviated in my notes as ET. Epithelial tissue covers surfaces and lines spaces. So we're going to spend some time going over epithelial tissue. Now connective tissue, you'll see that abbreviated as CT. This is a very diverse group of tissue. So we'll see here that structure truly does define its function. So if you remember, blood is a type of connective tissue. Bone is a type of connective tissue, as well as fat. So all of these things look very different, and they do very different things. So muscular tissue, what are the 3 types of muscular tissue? So we have 3 types. Overall, though, muscular tissue, its job is contractile, or to shorten. Now, nervous tissue, its role is going to be communication. To send messages through mainly electrical or action potentials, electrical stimulation through action potentials. Okay, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on 3 and 4. We're going to focus mainly on epithelial tissue and connective tissue. Okay. So where do these different tissues originate from? The different tissues originate from they all originate from stem cells. And to be a stem cell, you have to be unspecialized. You have to be an unspecialized cell. So in the very beginning, when you're still in your mom's womb, the very first cell that is you is called a zygote. And that cell goes through the process of mitosis and divides and finally becomes what's called a blastocyst. And this blastocyst is what's going to actually embed in your mom's uterus. And those cells begin to differentiate, become different things. And this very center part that I have circled here, those little red cells, is called an inner cell mass. And that grouping of cells is what's going to become the embryo. It's what's going to become the embryo. They're called the embryonic or embryo stem cells. And so basically, we have two types of stem cells. They're either embryonic, which are going to build bodies, or we have stem somatic cells, which are going to repair. They're both unspecialized, but they do two different things. Embryonic build bodies, whereas somatic repair bodies. Okay? So going back to our embryonic stem cells, that inner cell mass that becomes the embryo, that's going to become you. They're often referred to as pluripotent. So pluri means several, and potent means ability. So they're going to have several abilities. In other words, they're going to become many different things. These cells are going to specialize into several other cell types. And that's where these primary germ layers are going to arise from. We're going to get the ectoderm. This layer of tissue is going to become like your nervous system, your skin, your epithelial tissue known as the skin, the epidermis, and then also things like the lining of your oral cavity and the rectum. Then we're going to get the mesoderm. And this layer of tissue is going to specialize to become like your skeleton, your muscular system, cardiovascular system, the dermis of your skin, and your excretory system. And then finally, the last layer, the endoderm. This is going to become the epithelial lining of your digestive and respiratory tract, glands of your system, and the epithelial lining of your bladder. So we can see that this tissue, these stem cells, these embryonic stem cells are going to build up to become these primary germ layers that are then going to be specialized into the systems, the organ systems of your body. And then as far as somatic stem cells go, once things get damaged or are old, those stem cells are then going to repair your body. Okay. All right, so now let's focus on epithelial tissue. And all epithelial tissue lines spaces. It's a sheet of cells that lines a space. It's defined as such because it's found next to a space, and this space is often called a lumen. Okay, so in this picture we have our cells here in white, and they're connected to a structure, and this layer of cells here, this is what I'm referring to, and then it's connected to another structure, and then we have more tissue underneath it, and then this would be a blood vessel. Okay, so with our characteristics, we have, yes, it lines spaces. I have that it is closely packed together. So the cells are closely packed together. They always touch. So yes, it does. It is avascular. So there is not a blood supply within the tissue itself. It is actually underneath. So epithelial tissue is avascular. No blood supply. That means that nutrients are just going to have to diffuse through the tissue to get into the cells. Epithelial tissue is highly regenerative, meaning it's always going through mitosis. New cells are going to be regenerated. It has a basement membrane that's here in purple. It's connected on the deep side of the tissue, the basement membrane, to usually connective tissue. It's directional. It has polarity, meaning the side that's open to the space is often referred to as the apical edge or the luminal edge, and then the side that's connected to the basement membrane is considered the basilar edge. Or basolateral edge. It can often form sheets. So like with skin tissue, it'll form sheets, so not just one layer, but often multiple layers, but it still has to be open to a space. Okay, and then finally, all epithelial tissue cover and line spaces. And I have just some examples here. The pericardium is a serous membrane, and it is a double layer where the parietal edge lines the the mediastinum, and then the visceral layer lines the heart itself. Okay, so this would be the luminal or the lumen, the space, and it is epithelial tissue that makes up this membrane here. Okay? Remember, it always is the parietal side that touches the cavity, and it is the visceral side that actually touches the organ. So what are the main functions of epithelial tissue? So hopefully the first one you think of is protection. And think of your skin when you think of protection. It's epithelial tissue and lines our bodies and provides a layer of protection. This is the first layer of immunity for your body. Another main function is secretion. Secretion would be in this direction. For example, so things into the lumen or into the space. For example, glands will secrete things like mucus, hormones, sweat, other things, and provide lubrication. So maybe think of glands whenever you think of secretion. Glands are lined by epithelial tissue. And then finally, the last main epithelial function is absorption. So when you think of absorption, it's in this direction. From the space into the tissue, into the epithelial tissue. And one of the organ systems that does this is the digestive system. Takes things from the environment or from the lumen, the space, and pulls nutrients into the epithelial tissue. And epithelial tissue lines our digestive system. Okay, so secretion, I had it here, and then absorption here, if you're wondering what those blanks were for. But I blew it up so that you could see it better in this picture. Now, classifying epithelial tissue, all of this y'all went over in lab. I won't talk about it here, but it is in your notes filled out. The only part that I will talk about is transitional epithelial tissue. Perhaps you did not talk about that, but it is important. It's a type of epithelial tissue, particularly found in the bladder. So what happens here is that this is an example of what the tissue would look like whenever the bladder is full. It's more cuboidal in shape towards the basolateral edge, and towards the apical edge we get these rounded cells, rounded towards the luminal edge. And this would be whenever the bladder is empty. So now let's imagine that the bladder is full. the cells are going to sort of stretch out or transition into shape like this. And that is why they call it transitional. So they stretch out into this direction, allowing the bladder to essentially stretch. And now the epithelial tissue, instead of looking stratified here, it looks simple. That's why they call it transitional epithelial tissue. So one of the important structures that contains epithelial tissue are glands. And we have two broad categories of glands, and that's the exocrine and endocrine glands. So in general, glands are one or more cells that make and secrete an aqueous fluid known as a secretion. And I drew you just a typical picture of a gland with a lumen, and here it is lined with typically simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. And the basement membrane then is attached to some sort of connective tissue, and in general they will secrete out into the lumen, and somehow it is either going to release these secretions out to the outside of the body, or it's going to secrete them to the blood. And that is going to define the two types of glands. So exocrine secrete to the outside of the body, and these are going to be like sweat glands, or if the gland has a duct, it would be more of like a salivary gland. So then if the gland secretes things into the blood, for instance, like hormones, these do not generally have ducts, and they are really close to a blood supply. These are going to be, for example, like the pituitary gland, or the pineal gland. I could go on here. We have the adrenals. These are considered glands. Even the pancreas has both endocrine and exocrine function. So we could put the pancreas here on both, because it does both of these. Okay, so those are just some examples. Now, exocrines, they are classified as either unicellular or multicellular. And whenever you did tissues in lab, you actually talked about a unicellular exocrine gland, and that was a goblet cell. And if you remember, you find goblet cells in what type of tissue? In simple columnar epithelial tissue, and they secrete mucus. Now, multicellular exocrine glands, for example, these would be salivary glands. So those are just some examples, and we're going to go into more detail about sweat glands. So that's another example of a multicellular exocrine gland later on. Alright, so now let's move on to connective tissue. Connective tissue is defined as cells in a matrix of ground substance and fibers. So whatever the connective tissue is these cells in ground substance and fibers, and the ground substance and fibers is called the matrix. And there are a few characteristics that apply to all of this connective tissue. So connective tissue, its aim is supportive, or to support. They do not line spaces like epithelial tissue do. And they're usually highly vascular, meaning they have good blood supply. The only exception is cartilage. Cartilage is non-vascular. And cells are spaced far apart. That's not to say, though, that there are spaces in between the cells. For the in between the cells, we have the matrix. So the cells are far apart, and in between the cells is the matrix. Okay, and then the last characteristic I have is that they are very diverse. It is a pretty broad category. Let's take a look at connective tissue structure, and this is just general across connective tissue. Let's start with the fibers and ground substance. And if you remember, this makes up the matrix. As far as fibers go, we have collagen, reticular, and elastic. Collagen gives connective tissue strength. So collagen fibers are strong and not very stretchy. Reticular fibers are just another type of collagen fibers. So they're made of collagen. However, they are a thinner version of collagen. And then sometimes they will have elastic fibers. So sometimes connective tissue will actually have elastic fibers, and these are stretchy and made of elastin, the protein elastin. Now, ground substance is generally mostly water. So if you think of what is the ground substance in blood, and that's the plasma. And plasma is, the majority of plasma is actually water. We also have solutes. So an example of some of the solutes are glycosaminoglycans, which is a polysaccharide or a sugar, or proteoglycans, which is a protein bounded to a sugar. These are just two important solutes found in cartilage. So maybe you've heard of glucosamine. It's a supplement you can take for your joints. This is a type of solute that's found in the ground substance of cartilage. It is by nature super hydrophilic. It's a super hydrophilic solute, and it adds to or allows cartilage to be super moist. So we said earlier that cartilage is actually avascular, meaning it doesn't really have much of a blood supply. So how does it get its nutrients? Well, it's the chemical nature of solutes like glucosamine that its nature helps to pull in water, and by this it helps to diffuse in other nutrients so that the cartilage can get nutrients, oxygen and glucose, that sort of thing. So it helps to diffuse in nutrients in and out of the cartilage without a direct blood supply. So what about the cells that are found in connective tissue? Well, the stem cells in connective tissue are called mesenchymal. Mesenchymal cells, these are the stem cells in connective tissue. We'll also find fibroblast cells. These build fibers. Adipocytes, these are just fat cells. And we'll also find immune cells in connective tissue. We'll find macrophages, mast cells, and often lymphocytes. All right. Now let's do some classifying of connective tissue. We have three main categories here. We have connective tissue proper, structural or supporting connective tissue, and then fluid connective tissue. And fluid connective tissue, this is just blood. So we spend an entire lecture going over blood. Now, structural or supporting connective tissue, this is bone or cartilage. Make sure you know the categories under each of these. So bone, we would have spongy bone or compact bone. As far as cartilage goes, you went over this in lab, and the types of cartilage are hyaline. Hyaline, remember, is found in epiphyseal plates, the ends of your long bones. We also have fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage is super tough. It's found in places where you have a lot of grinding. So, for example, intervertebral disc, the meniscus of the knee is made up of fibrocartilage. And then finally we have elastic cartilage. The ends of your nose and also in your ears are made up of elastic cartilage. Now, connective tissue proper. So this is probably the type of tissue, connective tissue you think of whenever you actually think of connective tissue. We have two main categories, either dense or loose. So loose connective tissue proper is either adipose tissue, which is fat, areolar. That's probably what you think of whenever you say loose connective tissue, but it's actually areolar. Sometimes they do call it loose connective tissue, but make sure that you know its other name is areolar. It's found everywhere and it is very web-like, like a mat. And then finally we have reticular, which I'm not sure if you went over in lab. So this is found in places, in solid organs like lymph nodes or in the spleen will have reticular connective tissue. And then dense connective tissue proper is either regular or irregular. Either way, we're going to have thick, packed fibers that are packed together, really close together. So with regular, these fibers are lined up going the same way, whereas with irregular, it's just a pile of unorganized thick fibers. Okay? So unorganized versus organized. Both have really big, significant collagen fibers, though. All right. Let's talk about body membranes now. And we have four main categories of body membranes. And body membranes are defined by their location. So the first one we have are mucous membranes. We know that they line cavities that open to the external environment. It's kind of an epithelial and connective tissue sandwich-like structure that lines a space outside of the body. So, for instance, what about skin? Would skin be a mucous membrane? No. So skin is not, I did that backwards. Sorry, guys. Skin is not a mucous membrane. What about the inside of the mouth? Yes. That is considered a mucous membrane. Also, the stomach, inside of the stomach, and for example, the lining of the vagina would also be considered a mucous membrane. Okay? So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Now, secondly, we have serous membranes. Serous membranes line and cover organs and cavities inside the body. So we know that they are a double membrane, they're a double membrane, and we know that we have 3 in total. Okay, so it's a double layered membrane and we have a total of 3. in the body, and we'll talk some more about those in a second. The third category we have is synovial membranes. And synovial membranes are only found in synovial joints. And usually your synovial joints are the big moving joints in the body. Maybe the only one that you might not think of is actually your temporal mandibular joint, the one that is in your jaw. That's actually a synovial joint as well. So we'll spend a whole chapter talking about joints. So we won't really talk much about those right now. So then finally, number 4 is the cutaneous membrane, and this is the skin. And the next chapter talks all about the integumentary, which is the skin. So mucous membranes, what are they made of? Well, we know they line a space, so they must be made up of epithelial tissue. Okay, and often this epithelial tissue has goblet cells. So, got to draw some epithelial tissue here. And maybe we'll draw a little goblet cell in between our type of epithelial tissue. Here's a goblet cell. Remember, goblet cells make mucus. Okay. And deep to the epithelial tissue, then, would be connective tissue. And that connective tissue is often called the lamina propria. Okay, so connected to the basement membrane, that would be a basement membrane there. We would have the connective tissue. And that connective tissue is called the lamina propria. Okay, so that's what a diagram of a mucous membrane would look like. Now, what about serous membranes? What are they? Well, we know they're double layered membrane. Okay, we know they are a double layered membrane, but what are they made of? We know they line a space, so we have to have epithelial tissue, and it is typically simple squamous epithelial tissue, so really thin. Okay, connected to a basement membrane that's going to anchor it to some sort of connective tissue, and typically that connective tissue is a relar connective tissue. And that's what a serous membrane would look like. So what is the function of our serous membranes? Well, it's to produce serous fluid. And that fluid in that double layered membrane is to prevent or reduce friction. So if I draw you an example, one of our serous membranes is the pericardial membrane around the pericardial cavity. So let's draw the heart. And this is just a diagrammatical view of the membrane, okay? So keep that in mind. So it looks something to this effect. And no, this isn't anatomically correct, but it's just to show you what I'm talking about. So within this membrane, it's producing fluid. That would be the serous fluid. Okay, so within that space, that's the serous space. So the lining touching the heart would be the visceral pericardium, and then the lining touching the mediastinum, that cavity there, would be the parietal pericardium. Okay, so also remember we have two other serous membranes. We have the peritoneum, which is the one that lines the abdomen, and then we also have the pleural cavities, or the pleural membranes, which line the thoracic cavity around the lungs. All right. Now let's take a second and go over the components and some characteristics of cartilage. So cartilage, we talked about, is avascular, meaning it does not have a blood supply running through it. Cartilage is tough yet pretty flexible. And then later in life, the cartilage cells tend to calcify or ossify, which means they become bony because the chondrocytes die. So we'll talk about what these cells are here in a second. First of all, the components of cartilage. We know we have cells, ground substance, and fiber. And the ground substance and fibers make up the matrix of cartilage. The fibers, all cartilage has collagen in it. You can't really see the fibers in hyaline cartilage because they're pretty tiny, but they are there. They do have collagen fibers. We also have elastic fibers in like elastic cartilage. And then also in fibrocartilage, the collagen there is pretty thick and wavy. And remember, fibrocartilage is found in places that has a lot of wear and tear or grinding, like the intervertebral disc or the meniscus of the knee. Now, what about the ground substance? This is sort of review. The solutes there are very hydrophilic or water-loving, and that is to help cells diffuse in food and water. Again, moist cartilage is considered healthy cartilage. Now, what about the cells? The cells in cartilage, we have, because they're connective tissue, we have mesenchymal, which you remember those are stem cells. And then these mesenchymal cells will become chondroblasts. Chondro referring to cartilage, and these chondroblasts, they're a type of fibroblasts. They're going to produce the ground substance in fibers. So let's draw a chondroblast here. There's its little nucleus. This is a chondroblast. And it is going to be producing this ground substance and fibers until it builds its own little lacuna that it's going to live in. And once it becomes trapped in its lacuna, then it will become a chondrocyte. And that is just a cartilage cell. Okay? Now let's review bone tissue and its components and function. The function of bone tissue is to support and protect our body structures. So you can think of your cranium supporting or protecting your brain, or your rib cage protecting your heart and your lungs. It also is a way to store fat in the marrow and to make blood cells, red blood cells and white blood cells in your bone marrow. So we have two types of bone. We have compact and spongy. Compact bone is made up of osteons. And spongy bone is made up of, or sort of looks like this, if you will. And here are our bone cells, and these little juts off of it are called spicules or trabeculae. Whereas compact bone has a central canal and is much more ordered in its appearance. Okay. Now, as far as the cells that make up bone tissue, we start off with a mesenchymal cell, which, with connective tissue, since bone is connective tissue, we call the stem cells mesenchymal. And this mesenchymal cell will become an osteoblast. Osteo referring to bone. And this osteoblast, remember, it produces our ground substance and fibers that make up the matrix. The ground substance is made up of osteoid and hydroxyapatite. The osteoid gives bone its flexibility and is sort of gooey in nature, whereas the hydroxyapatite is the mineral portion of bone and gives bone its strength. We also have fibers in bone that are made up of collagen. So going back to our osteoblast, our bone cell that is going to build or produce ground substance and fibers. So if we draw a little osteoblast here, what happens is that it produces or builds its own little lacuna. That's the lacuna there. And once it surrounds itself in its own little lacuna, then it will become an osteocyte, bone cell. Okay? There's one more bone cell that doesn't really come from a mesenchymal cell, though, and it is called an osteoblast. Sorry, I said that wrong. Osteoclast. Should be a C there. Osteoclast. And it's actually a type of macrophage. It's a type of macrophage. And it looks something like this. And it has multiple nuclei. So we draw a bunch of nuclei in our osteoclast. And its role is to eat away at the bone matrix. And by doing this, it enables bone to remodel itself. So this is an osteoclast, and it eats bone. Eats away at bone and allows it to, enables bone to remodel. Alright, so now I want to talk about how bone is actually formed, or how it is actually made. And there are two basic ways, either intramembranous ossification or endochondral ossification. So intramembranous ossification is how flat bones are made. So this happens with flat bones. And it begins with an existing connective tissue or connective membrane source. So we start off with a dense, irregular connective tissue membrane, and this is where the bone is actually going to form. And within this connective tissue, we have mesenchymal cells, which we remember are the stem cells of connective tissue. So we have our mesenchymal cells, which will become osteoblasts. Sorry, I wrote that on the wrong one. These mesenchymal cells will become osteoblasts. And these osteoblasts are they're going to make the matrix. Remember, they're going to be turning out the ground substance and fibers, which essentially is going to actually be bone tissue. And then step 3 of this process, these osteoblasts are going to turn into osteocytes. Eventually, it will become spongy bone. And then eventually, it will become compact bone. And I drew you a little picture down here, a slice through what a flat bone would look like. So we have spongy bone here in the middle, surrounded by compact bone. and that is surrounded by the membrane, the dense irregular connective tissue membrane, the periosteum. All right, so now what about this second wave? This is an endochondral ossification. So it tells us that we're going to start with a cartilage base. And this is how we form long bones. Okay, so it starts with a hyaline cartilage model. And so I drew you a little picture of a long bone here. And it's going to start with cartilage cells. So if it's hyaline cartilage, it starts off with hyaline cartilage. Then our hyaline cartilage is going to contain cartilage cells. So we'll call them CCs for chondrocytes, so that we know their cartilage cells are make up this structure here, this hyaline cartilage. So make a note of that it begins with hyaline cartilage. So now, how does this begin, this ossification? Well, we got to start with some stem cells. So we have some mesenchymal cells that will become osteoblasts. And the osteoblasts will produce a bony collar. So the mesenchymal cells are right here. They're found in this outer portion right here that surround this cartilage. And they're going to produce this bony collar. This is the bony collar. And this bony collar cuts off diffusion to the cartilage. And we know cartilage is avascular, doesn't have a blood supply. So if we're cutting off diffusion, its only way of getting nutrients, that means what's going to happen to our chondrocytes? Well, our chondrocytes, our cartilage cells, start to die. And they poop out this sort of concrete substance. It's a calcified matrix. It's a calcified cartilage matrix. And once this happens, what's called a periosteal bud, right here, enters into and breaks through that bony collar. And this is basically just a blood vessel. And with it, it's carrying osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So they hitch a ride into this region, into that cartilage matrix, and they start to build bone. And this is that process of endocardial ossification. So it busts through that bony collar and eats through, and then we'll start to ossify this cartilage. Alright, so the other thing I wanted to mention is that, remember with long bones we have epiphyseal plates, and those are found at the ends of long bones. So we know bones are surrounded by a connective tissue called periosteum. Now, if it is surrounding cartilage, it wouldn't be called periosteum. It would be called perichondrium. So when it is still an epiphyseal plate, this part is called a perichondrium. So this region right here would be a perichondrium. Now the part that surrounds, once it's bone, then would be called periosteum. Alright, so these last 2 pages of notes go over the final 2 broad categories of tissue, and that's muscle and nervous tissue. So I would suggest knowing the characteristics and the functions listed in your notes. So muscle tissue, its main function is to shorten. And that's to shorten or contract along its long axis. And we have 3 types: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. So make sure you know your types, know its function, and then also these characteristics. So skeletal and cardiac are striated. And when we go over muscle, we'll learn that these striations are created by the sarcomeres within the muscle cells. Okay? The skeletal muscle is voluntary. It is the only one that is voluntary. So smooth and cardiac are involuntary. Meaning we do not think to contract them. Skeletal muscle is or has multiple nucleus. So it has many nuclei per cell, whereas the other ones only have one nucleus per cell. What else? The smooth muscle looks different. It is a spindle-like shape. So it is spindle in shape, whereas cardiac muscle is branched. And also has these neat features that connect one cell to the other called intercalated discs. These are functionally relevant for cardiac muscle cells. Alright, so what about nervous tissue? The functional unit of nervous tissue is the neuron. And I would suggest knowing some brief anatomy of the neuron. So this main structure here is the neural body or soma. So this is the neural body or neuron cell body or soma. These branches off of the body are called dendrites. And these little dots that you often see surrounding them, they're called glial cells. Now the longest extension off of the cell body is called the axon. And it's not empty, it's actually filled with cytoplasm itself. And it is crucial for carrying the action potential down the neuron. Okay? Neurons pass this information in the form of electricity. And we call those action potentials. Action potentials. And they send the action potential down the axon of the neuron towards the axon terminal. To the axon knobs or terminal knobs, and then send a message across this space here called the synapse. Okay. And they release a chemical here called a neurotransmitter. So this message, the action potential, this is electricity. And once it reaches the end of the neuron, it's going to release a chemical out into the space. So it's an electrical message and a chemical message. This chemical message is called a neurotransmitter. I'll write that down here for you. And neurotransmitters will find its receptor on a specific effector. So the cell could be another neuron, or it could be a muscle cell or something else. Okay? And this direction only goes, or this message only goes in one direction. It does not go this way. It is very directional. It can only go in one way. Alright, so I think that's everything I need to tell you. Alright, so this was chapter 5. So happy studying. If you have any questions, please email me.